This took place to a forest somewhere in Georgia when one of my friends was there for spring break. His name was Max, and he was about 14 at the time of this story. It was sometime in 2015 during March break, or spring break, whatever you prefer to call it. Max was visiting Georgia with a few of his friends, and basically, he was with his family too, since he was 14 after all. Max and his friends, along with his family, were hiking through a very popular woods in Georgia. I can't remember the name of the location or forest it was at, but it was around somewhere around maybe near Atlanta or Savannah. It might have been between those two places, but I honestly don't remember. But you get the picture. Max, along with his friends and his parents, were hiking through a very popular trail there. In the trail, they would see some bikers passing by with their dogs and some other hikers and etc. Of course, other bikers take this path too, but that was just the point. They were walking through the trail when Max's parents ended up deciding to stop at a rest stop when his friends decided they would go on a different trail. His parents gave him some rules such as stay together, do not go off the path, and etc. Since there was no cell service, they had walkie-talkies, which of course, Max and his friends were able to go through the forest without any issues. They knew the path very well as they visited Georgia pretty much almost every year, so they were walking through the trails. As they were walking through the trails, Max all of a sudden could hear crying. The crying sounded like a girl, no older than 16. He all looked at his friends, who they were around 14 to 17, the oldest being Jennifer. Since she heard the noise too, they said it sounded like someone was crying and that they needed help. They ended up going over to see what was wrong. They ended up walking through the path, and the crying started to get louder and louder. But as they were going through, they couldn't find any girl and were assuming that if she was lost, they would report the rangers that there was a missing person in the area. However, though, that was not all. When Jennifer, upon inspecting the forest, she called out if the girl was around but got no response. Then something hit her like a brick. The crying is on a loop. It's the same wail and tone and wheeze being played over and over again. That was their cue to get the hell out of there. They end up running down the path without looking back, and they ended up being back at the rest stop. Max's parents were confused and asked his friends what happened, and they said everything that happened. The ranger got some search and rescue people, but there was no girl crying in those woods. They still have no idea if this was to lure them in some trap or not, but they do know for one thing. There was certainly no girl crying in those woods. This story happened to me last year in 2021. Now, this is not really the type of story that is, necessarily hiking, but it's basically on a trail that I was hiking on horse. Wanted to put that out there for some context. This happened in the summer of 2021, and this took place sometime near the end of June. Canada Day was approaching within a few days at the time, so I decided to do a trail ride before the holiday. I won't say the name of the barn for privacy reasons, but it was a horse riding stable that does trail rides during the summer and fall months. I decided to do a 2-hour trail ride, which involved crossing a road, rocky terrain, etc. It wasn't a big deal though. Seeing that I'm a very experienced rider, I have been around horses for years, you can say. When I got to the barn, I was on a Palomino no gelding named Piper. Piper was a very common, easygoing gelding, not stubborn like the other geldings I have rode in the past, but he was very responsive to commands. My trail guide, which we'll call her Miranda, was with me during this event. I've been on a few horse trails and did have experienced some creepy weird stuff, but this takes the cake. When Miranda got on her horse, she was in front of me as she knew where the trail was very well. As we were on the trail, we got into some dense forest after crossing a road to a big trail that led onto the forest. As soon as we were in the forest, Piper's ears were forward as he was alert for something. It was very common for horses to move their ears like that, so I was used to their body language. Like ears pinned back means they're angry, biting, kicking, etc. I have been reading about horses since I was in elementary school, so I have some knowledge about horses. Fast forward to about 20 minutes into the trail, Miranda and I climbed up a steep and rocky hill. It wasn't hard, seeing that I have done it before, and that it didn't seem to be a problem. When we reached the top of the hill, we stopped to allow our horses to catch their breaths as we looked around our surroundings. I noticed on the left side there was a figure. Now I couldn't really see it clearly, but it looked like someone was walking through the trees. Miranda did say there were other people that hike on the trails as well, so I thought that was the case. As soon as we got our horses to start walking forward, I looked to my left to see a black figure was moving at the same pace as we are. Now this was getting weird, seeing that I have no idea what that figure was. As soon as we got into a big open field, Piper looked to the left and we heard some twigs snaps along with leaves crunching on the ground. I could see that figure was about 20 feet away from us, and Miranda called out if it was a hiker. However, when she called out the figure, it didn't speak or did anything. Whatever it did, it ran off until it was out of sight. As we were confused as our trail ride, Miranda and I could see a campsite that looked like was trashed. The tent was ripped, clothes and belongings were thrown all over the place. We were confused as to what happened, but regardless, we continued on our trail ride. As we got back into the woods after crossing the open field, we could see some of the trees had markings on them. Some of them were painted in blue and others were painted in red, and they were even more confused. We continued to go down the trail, but as we got closer, something nearly made the horses spook. The figure I saw earlier was 15 feet away when I ran across the trail. As it ran across the trail, it let out a gargling scream. It sounded like a woman, and I was confused as to why she was screaming. We got our horses to trot and go after the woman, but when we got to where the woman turned, she was gone. The scream of that woman sounded like she was no older than 30. Piper then looked to the right to see a sign, and the woods was rotting, and we knew that the sign was old. Miranda and I decided to go check out the sign, and as we did, there was an arrow with some woods burned off. We didn't even know what the sign said as it was blurred off or what it was saying, so we headed off in that direction. As we kept walking, I looked at the trees to see some skulls were nailed to the wall. Most of them were from birds to human skulls, and this made me almost sick. We kept going the path until we could see a wooden structure in the distance. It looked like an old cabin. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years, so we headed off in that direction. When we got to the cabin in the clearing, we saw a lot of bones from animals and even humans as well. We can even see that the cabin, it looked like it was burned down by a fire, but we weren't really know for sure how recent the fire was. Miranda and I then saw some writing on the wood planks that were nailed to the trees. They were all related to death and Satan. Whoever made this must be some cult in the area, but the only problem was the fact that there was no one around. Then I started to hear some voices. It sounded like a ghostly voice. It sounded like, "Get out of here. Burn the witch." I thought in my mind was playing tricks on me, and that when we heard a sound was crying from a woman. I thought it was the same woman who we saw earlier, and that we saw the woman that we spotted early in the trail. As we looked up, she had long, messy black hair with brown eyes, and she was dressed as if she was in a Halloween costume, but she didn't have anyone to get in or have anyone with her. Whatever happened next really made us get the hell out of there. The woman let out a wicked cackle. Then she let out a scream of terror. Piper started to back off and turn around before galloping off, and Miranda and her horse followed us out of the area. We didn't stop galloping until we got far away from that place. Piper eventually calmed down within 15 minutes. As soon as we were safe, Miranda and I were quiet for the rest of the trail ride. As soon as we got back to the barn, we let the owner of the know about the woman we saw. After what happened, they explained what happened. The owner decided not to call the authorities about what we saw. If the authorities did get involved, it would be very hard to track down that woman. Plus, with her being out in the forest, it would be impossible for her or her spot, that is, if it's run by a cult. I always thought witches were scary and only exist in stories and movies, but after this experience, I really don't know what to think. A part of me says that it is real, and a part of me said that it was completely paranormal. To give a little bit of context, this happened to one of my good friends, and she and I unfortunately are no longer connected due to the fact that we both have moved on from each other. Her name was Sarah. Sarah was about 16 at the time, and this took place in 2016. Since Sarah and I were good friends at the time, Sarah went on a lot of hikes, especially in the summer. She and her family liked to go camping and hunting. Sometimes they even hike around the woods. However, though, one of the times that they had hiked, they discovered something really creepy. They were hiking in the woods, and it was during one of the times when it was around close to hunting season, so they wanted to get a head start on some hunting. They were looking around to see if they could find any deer or any places to go fishing when Sarah noticed that there was something going on one of the trails. There were footprints what seemed to look like that of a deer. So she follows it and realizes that there was a deer standing about a few feet away. Since Sarah was hiking, she decided to take a aim at the deer. She ended up about to shoot it when it all of a sudden took off running away into the woods. Sarah thought that maybe some other hiker were walking by and that must have been the case, but she couldn't see anyone. Now, coming into hikers was one of the most rarest things, as this trail was pretty much isolated from all the campsites for the most part. However, though, Sarah ended up realizing that there was some shadow in the woods. Now, she couldn't honestly tell who it was, but she ended up getting her dad's attention. Her dad ended up looking over and saw that figure was standing there. It didn't look like it had any weapons or anything. It was just staring at them, whatever it was, and took off into the woods. Of course, they reported it to the authorities and even the park rangers, but they didn't find anyone there. They had no idea if it was a real man attempting to try and kidnap Sarah, kill her, or at least do some God knows what to her. But whenever they went through the trail, they never saw whatever it was again.